where is it? Canton. This is the man who is said to be so clever that no one can understand him. Whereas actually the very mark of cleverness is to make oneself understood. I've read most of William's utterances, and I've even read his big theological book on Arius. This reads like the Stanway Unwin version of the Constitution of the former Soviet Union. But since style is not merely an ornament, but style is the very essence of the mind, the inside of William's head must be like a collection of landscapes by Salvador Dali. But why does he always poke his nose into other people's business? I mean, I'm a priest, and I've never heard him say anything wise or memorable about prayer or the sacraments or trying to keep the Ten Commandments. But I do remember his political interventions. How he said that the 9/11 atrocity was our fault because the terrorists had no choice. How he'd like a little bit of Sharia law introduced in England. How odd that a man who describes himself as a hairy lefty should want to foist on us the irrational intolerance and sheer barbarism of the mullahs. Yeah. And the Archbishop's most recent excursion was to attack the government over its cuts programme. He is a sentimental socialist. It reminded me of an earlier ecclesiastical intervention, a salvo fired at the government in the 1930s, when another Archbishop of Canterbury asked if he could mediate in a coal miners' strike, and Stanley Baldwin replied, "Only if you let the National Union of Mine Workers rewrite the Athanasian Creed." But what is all this talk about government cuts? There are no government cuts. Public expenditure is still rising year on year, and by the end of this coalition's term of office, if regrettably it actually lasts out to the last dreg, we shall be spending more than when they came in. What is actually happening is that the socialists, that is, the typically self-seeking bosses of town councils, are continuing to award themselves their own bloated salaries. They are also maintaining all the politically correct non-jobs. You know, the lesbian and interracial ping-pong liaisons. And then they close the libraries, the leisure centres and the swimming pools and blame these closures on the government's so-called cuts programme. It goes without saying, my friends, that the BBC every day denounces the cuts as the war of a wicked, cruel, capitalist or even medieval government on its own people. But the BBC continues to pay its own staff astronomical salaries. Those of us who live in the real world, and not the world of spin and presentation and image and a political journalism of the most dishonest sort. And is there any other sort, by the way, of political journalism other than the dishonest? We know that the country is drowning in debt. And unless our children and grandchildren are to be burdened with this suffocating debt, there have to be real and actual cuts, real and actual reforms of public expenditure. But these cuts and reforms will never happen because the government's own self-interest and short-termism will deny them. For example, let me give one example. There is no possibility at all of reforming the National Health Service. If it had been possible, it would have been done before now. Every government since the 1970s has tried and failed. That the NHS is crying out for reform is not in doubt. It is the world's biggest employer next to the People's Republic of China, the army thereof. More people work for the NHS than there are in the whole population of Estonia, and its budget is larger than that of many countries. But the government plays all the time on our sentimental attachment to the NHS as the envy of the world. It is nothing of the sort. It is a shambles. People come out of hospital in a worse physical and mental condition than when they went in. MRSA is endemic. Bed sores. Patients neglected, not fed, not changed, and in the worst cases being left to die of thirst. Consider this figure. 25,000 new cases of thrombosis every year caused directly by hospital conditions. And this is on their own admission. What lies are they telling us? If this is what they admit, how much worse is it? I suggest the NHS is something like a low-key Belsen. I visit all the hospitals I actually go into these places. I visit all the hospitals in London, and I have seen these conditions for myself. Most of these places are absolutely filthy. You wouldn't even want to visit them, let alone put your grandmother there. But the NHS will never receive the radical and sane reform that it needs. So what will happen to it? I'll tell you. It will continue to grow ever more bloated, increasingly hamstrung by its own massively incompetent bureaucratic procedures, until it collapses under the monstrous weight of its ponderous inefficiency and its impossible financial demands. But why can the NHS never be reformed? Well, when the NHS was instituted,